Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar. I would like to welcome you all to today's session, which is about the role of council procurement in disaster recovery. Before we get started with this presentation, I would like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Evariste Ngenzi. I'm a procurement consultant here at LGP, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Some housekeeping for today's webinar. Please keep your mics on mute throughout. For any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box during the webinar. We will have time for Q&A at the end of this session. This webinar will be recorded and it will be made available on our website in the due course. Before I start my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we are joining today at LGP, the Gadigal people of Eora Nation. We also acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands from which you are viewing this webinar. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also would like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. In this webinar, we'll be looking at the purpose of it, and we'll look at the overview of natural disasters spend in the financial year 2021-2022. And also we'll look at a regulatory framework for council's procurement during natural disasters. And also we will have a look on post-disaster procurement risks, which will be followed by a fireside chat with our guest. And then we will have a session for Q&A where all the participants are allowed to send through their questions via the chat box. Now, overall, the purpose of this webinar is to share information, knowledge, skills, and best practices with council members and procurement professionals to effectively contribute to the recovery process following a disaster. New South Wales have had 29 declared natural disasters in the last 2 financial years. Over the 2021-2022 financial year, $1.4 billion was spent by the New South Wales government in response to the natural disasters. The estimated damage to council's infrastructure assets totaled $349 million. 83 councils out of total 128 LGAs in New South Wales were impacted by the natural disaster during financial year 2021-2022. 128 million spent on cleanup, emergency responses, and other costs. Over the first half of 2022-2023 financial year, councils experienced further damages to infrastructure assets due to natural disasters to the tune of $1.1 billion. Despite the emergency provisions in the declared state of emergency, councils may be required to follow directives of New South Wales public sector agencies or relevant local, regional, or state emergency operation controllers. Given their closeness to the communities, local councils play a key role in responding to local emergencies. Council employees may provide direct support to first responders during the fires and floods and assist in the recovery phase. After the initial dangers of a natural disaster have passed, councils repair or rebuild damaged infrastructure and assets, clean up waste and debris, and assist impacted residents. In recent years, in part due to more severe and long-lasting natural disasters, councils have begun their recovery phase before the response phase has ended. Recovery and rebuilding may be costly and take time of months or years to complete. Bearing in mind the magnitude of the damage and destructions inflicted on council infrastructures, as well as the communities, there are emergency provisions in local government tendering legislations that helps councils to quickly respond. Section 55(3)(a) of the Local Government Act allow councils to enter into contract over and above the tendering threshold without going through a lengthy tender process. The newly inserted Section 170A of Local Government General Regulation prescribes a tendering exemption threshold of 500,000 Australian dollars for contracts entered into by local councils primarily for the purpose of responding to a declared natural disaster within 12 months of such declaration. Sorry, my slides have played up. Despite the emergency provisions we've just discussed, let's now look at procurement risks post-disaster. Supply chains can suffer from shortages of crucial or critical raw materials and components. Additionally, damaged infrastructure and facilities can force production halt, causing a ripple effect throughout the entire supply chain. Natural disasters can create both supply and demand shocks that affect prices and product availability. Supply shocks originate in the destruction of production capacity and the disruption of supply chain. Poor supplier sourcing will increase cost, supply delays, customer complaint, and reputation damage. Penalties on regulatory non-compliance comes in multiple forms, including financial fines, additional barriers to approvals, and even prison. Lack of internal sourcing or lack of internal resources can be both human resources to attend to post-disaster procurement needs or lack of materials or equipment or tools. Now we've come to the most exciting part of this webinar, the fireside chat with our guest. Please allow me to welcome our guest for today's webinar, Bronwyn Charles.
Hi, Everest. Thank you for having me. Very good to be here. Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming along.
Yeah, thank you, Bronwyn. Just before I start, maybe I will just give a quick introduction about Bronwyn. Bronwyn is an experienced procurement professional with a passion for improving the procurement practices of councils. Living on the far north coast of New South Wales, Bronwyn has first-hand experience of the impact that natural disasters have on councils and their communities. Bronwyn's vision is for councils' procurement functions to be included in disaster planning, response and recovery activities, which the potential to deliver significant savings and efficiencies for councils and help communities recover more quickly from the natural disaster. So to start with the conversation with Bronwyn, I would like to pose this question. Bronwyn, having previously worked in council procurement and particularly in the disaster-prone area, can you tell us what would that typical role of procurement staff in disaster recovery efforts Also, connected to this, what are some of the key challenges that councils often face in procurement during disaster recovery?
Sure, thanks, Everest. Look, I think the first thing to point out is that procurement is often not involved in disaster recovery, particularly in those early, response stages, which I think is a bit of a missed opportunity. The time following a natural disaster is very complex for councils. They're supporting communities in distress. Council staff are often personally affected themselves. Councils may well have lost some of their own infrastructure or property. They're expected to maintain services at the same time as responding to the disaster. And there's often access problems as well, which just further complicates things, slows things down, and makes everything that bit more difficult. So this means that procurement can often get a little bit messy as people are scrambling to get things done and in place with whatever resources they can access. So what the result often is there's a duplication of effort, with council staff often going out buying similar things without awareness of that others are doing the same. Councils will often report that they feel like they're paying more. Some suppliers will take advantage of that sense of urgency, or the fact that there's disrupted supply chains or not as many people around to do the work. And it's possible that council staff, they're under the pump, and they may not be feel like they can spend as much time paying attention to that procurement as they might usually. So then that can lead to a lack of transparency and accountability when engaging suppliers because of the lack of resources and the urgency.
Thank you, Bronwyn. My next question is that how can councils balance the need for speed in procurement with the necessity for transparency and accountability when responding to disaster recovery needs?
Yeah, so the need for transparency and accountability doesn't go away following a disaster. It's still really important that councils remain accountable for the public money that they're spending. But we do often see it taking a bit of a back seat, particularly in the immediate aftermath. So I think it's useful if we think about disaster response and recovery, particularly in relation to procurement, in 3 phases. So there's that immediate aftermath. It's all about that responding to the disaster, dealing with emergencies, threats to life, property, and the environment. And just noting, there was a comment in the chat that councils aren't the primary combat agency, and absolutely understand that. But there is work that councils get involved in from the beginning. And in that immediate aftermath, there's also, the focus on reducing further loss and making things safe. Then once that, the immediate emergency is over, you've got probably the first year when there's a focus on those high priority repairs to ensure safety and access for the community. And then after about that first year, you have the ongoing recovery that does ultimately result in full recovery from the disaster, but will often take a number of years to complete. So as I was saying earlier, look, the immediate aftermath is really a very difficult time, and it's made even more difficult if people are trying to have to undertake new or different processes to get things done. It's really not the time to be learning something new. So I think that all councils, and especially those that are prone to natural disasters, would do well to plan well ahead of time. So they've got procedures and practices in place to ensure that transparency and accountability throughout the disaster recovery process. So, for example, having access to panels of trusted suppliers where there's agreed pricing, there's terms and conditions in place that councils can access. And the agreed pricing is useful not just for saving money, but might also help to provide more accurate estimates for disaster recovery grants. So obviously LGP panels are an obvious solution to that, but councils often have their own panels in place for things that they do as business as usual, but then would also like to rely heavily on during times of disaster. So for example, tree services. So just making sure that those panels have things in place to that councils can lean on when they do need to following a disaster.
Yeah.
And also councils, as we've spoken about, the increase in the tendering threshold to 500,000 for 12 months following the declaration of a natural disaster. This means, so councils will always have procurement processes in place up to the tendering threshold, but when there's a disaster, the tendering threshold's gone up to $500,000. Just providing that clarity about the correct process to undertake for things between, say, 250 and 500,000. So, is it okay to directly engage a supplier, say, for $400,000, or would you prefer your staff to be going out and getting quotes? So, don't assume that your usual processes and thresholds will be applicable following a natural disaster, and ensure that your procedures do provide clarity over exactly what's okay to do in disaster recovery.
Right. Thank you for that, Bronwyn. And again, my other question would that could you please share some best practices for councils engaging in procurement activities during the recovery phase of a disaster? And if you can also touch on what LGP has in place to support councils during the disaster recovery phase.
Sure. Look, as I was saying, I think the most important thing is that there's clear policies, procedures in place that deal specifically with disaster recovery. That provides staff with certainty around what they need to do, which really does speed things up because they aren't sort of sitting around wondering if they're doing the right thing or not. And I know in my role as business development manager for the North, that following the Northern Rivers floods, the most recent ones, I did get a lot of questions from council staff seeking clarity over what they could and couldn't do. So having that in council's own procedures would really help empower staff. Also, becoming aware of how the Local Government Act and regulations does support councils recovering from a disaster. So, Everest, you were talking earlier about Section 55, Clause 3A, that says that councils don't need to invite tenders for contracts over the tendering threshold when the contract is made in the case of an emergency. So, the important thing to note here is that the Act doesn't define what an emergency is. So it's really essential that each council does have a working definition in their policy or procedures about what they think an emergency is, so that staff can then rely on that exemption when it's appropriate and required. There's also the increase to the tendering threshold, as we were talking about before. And important to note that that's only for disaster-related activities. So for anything that's business as usual, the 250,000 threshold does still apply. So council policies and procedures should provide guidance for staff around how to rely on these provisions of the Act and regulations, because there's often not a lot of clarity. And something else to consider is the use of pre-existing resources. So you asked me to touch on some things that LGP have in place. On our website, we do have a section dedicated to disaster recovery. You can access it from our homepage. There we do have a quick guide for procurement post-disaster. So it's just a simple one-page infographic that steps out the different phases and what councils can and shouldn't do. We've also got a spreadsheet that we put together that maps the goods and services that are often needed following a disaster to the LGP panels that can provide them. So we did this as part of our LGP's last strategic plan, and we surveyed our entire supplier base of around 900 suppliers, asking them if they're willing and able to help councils, in that disaster recovery phase. And there was a resounding message that absolutely they are able to and very willing to help if they're asked. And then we asked what they could do, and what came from the suppliers was fantastic. So things that are available under LGP panels that might be useful when recovering from a disaster, things like temporary community buildings, temporary refueling solutions, mobile electricity supply, mobile telecommunications, so like on a satellite on a trailer, for example, And then the obvious ones, road construction, temporary staff, and all types of engineering consulting services. So what that means is that councils, when they often their usual suppliers might be out of action or engaged somewhere else, they can come and use our panels. The insurances are in place. There's benchmark pricing that's in place. There's terms and conditions. So it's quite low risk compared to just, finding someone in Google.
Yeah.
There's also LGP consulting can assist with the development of policies and procedures, but as well also undertake procurement activities. So, for example, especially when disaster recovery goes on for a number of years, there's a necessary requirement to maintain business as usual activities as well as the disaster recovery things. So outsourcing some of that to LGP consulting is always an option. And then you've got the business development team who's always happy to provide advice on appropriate procurement strategies or, some clarification around legislation and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And just one other thing for the audience to note is that we've included disaster response in our strategic plan again that's just started this year. So as part of that, the project team's developing additional resources as well. So we'd really be happy to receive any feedback that councils have around things that might help them to, improve the efficiency and efficacy of their post-disaster procurement.
Yep, that's good. Thank you. Another question is that what steps can council take in advance to better prepare for the procurement challenges associated with disaster recovery?
Look, I think every council should consider adding procurement to council's disaster response and business continuity plans. I don't think that happens much, but I do think there is a role for procurement there. And having procurement involved from the beginning can really help improve how a council responds to a disaster. As I mentioned before, ensuring procurement policies and procedures adequately address disaster recovery and support staff to make sure that they can take advantage of existing provisions and resources. Know ahead of time the resources that are available to you and ensure staff are aware and trained in how to use them. So, for example, if part of your disaster recovery strategy is to use LGP panels, make sure that staff are aware of what's under those panels and that they're trained because, quite frankly, no one wants to be learning a new process when time's of the essence and you're low on resources. And I think also as part of that planning, think ahead of time whether you'll maintain business as usual activities as well as, while you're recovering from the disaster. And if you will, and you do want to maintain that BAU stuff, then, how are you going to do that? Because councils typically don't have the in-house resources to do both. So having a plan around how you'll manage that, I think, would be really useful.
Yeah. That's very good. I think my other question looks like you've already touched on it in some ways, but I will read it anyway and then connect it with the last question, just to be mindful of time. This question, which I said that you have covered some of it, is how can council integrate procurement considerations into their overall disaster recovery planning? And maybe I can also connect this with the last one that I have for you, Bronwyn, that, based on your experience, what are some variable lessons that councils can learn from past disaster recovery efforts in terms of procurement? And are there common pitfalls that councils should be aware of and strive to avoid?
Sure. Back to the planning. Look, I think it's about undertaking a procurement risk assessment through a disaster recovery lens, and then planning accordingly. So with that disaster recovery planning, specifically address procurement. Procurement people out there, get involved, ask questions, see how you can help. And for non-procurement people, look, don't underestimate the ability of procurement to really assist with your planning. And on that, look, I think procurement as a function, like not the people, but I think procurement can have a real impact on disaster recovery, a negative impact if procurement's not included in that planning. It can really slow things down. So, for example, I've heard stories of communities waiting for a road to be reopened because council's running a tender for some complicated geotechnical services, when they could have just as easily accessed the same suppliers through the LGP Professional Consulting Services panel, and or either directly or run a quote to get those services they needed, which would have been much quicker. I've also seen council staff engage suppliers under the emergency provisions of the Act, and then continue to engage that same supplier for a number of months or years. And I've actually taken phone calls about how councils can avoid doing that. And I think the key there is to make sure there's a clearly defined scope of that emergency piece. And once it's done, then do a different procurement for the ongoing work. I think being able to address price certainty can go a long way to, helping with some challenges around grant funding for disaster recovery. And also just that if there's not specific procedures in place to support disaster recovery procurement, it can slow things down because staff are often stuck in a state of flux and procrastination because they're uncertain of how to proceed. So just quickly to summarise, I think staff involved in disaster recovery procurement can be really empowered by ensuring procurement's built into council's disaster recovery planning, ensuring that procurement procedures have specific provisions for disaster recovery, ensuring that staff are aware of and know how to access and use the resources that are available to them. And most importantly, get your procurement people involved in disaster planning well ahead of time.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much, Bronwyn, for your insights. And now this brings me to brings us to the end of our fireside chat. But just a reminder that if you have any questions, please put these in the chat box, and our colleague Catherine will read them for us. If there are any questions in the chat box already, Catherine, would you please unmute yourself and read them for Bronwyn to respond? Thanks.
So we have a question from Vicky Downer. It says, is there a procurement impact when there are compounded or sequential emergencies? For example, when procurement for one event has to be extended to cover the next event?
Yes, I wish, this is a really difficult situation. Yes, we do see that. And look, I think a lot of the time it also comes down to common sense. So if this sort of thing happens, making sure that you're documenting the decisions you've made and why. So, we've seen it up here in the Northern Rivers. There was a flood and we're just getting started with recovery, and then there's a second flood, more emergencies. So, yes, there can be an impact, but I think if you make sure that you're clearly documenting what you're doing and why, then you can't go too wrong.
All right. Any other question, Catherine?
There are no other questions at the moment.
All right. If there's any other question, I guess, any other question? Someone is looking into the chat box. No, any other question?
My apologies. Oh no, sorry. There is a comment here. It is important to remember that it's often not the case of knowledge of requirements, but the volume in services required. And so does LGP provide a link to boost resources to councils for project disaster management and procurement?
Sorry, Catherine, can you just say that last bit again?
Sure. It says, does LGP provide a link to boost resources to councils for project disaster management and procurement?
Yes, so that would be provided through our consulting team, and more than happy to have a discussion around that.
Okay, and then another question from Nicole Parsons. Are there any specific leading practice examples of council policies that you can point to or share which identify these mentioned processes for procurement during and post an event?
I personally am not aware of them. My observations is that it's needed, but Look, I think it's a really good question to ask on the LGP forum on our website, which goes out to all the councils around the state, and just ask if people have put those in place. You know, and I'm more than happy also to have a discussion with anyone who wants to sort of thrash that out, not here now, but at a later time, about what that might look like as well. But I do think it's my experience is a lot of confusion from council staff around what they can and can't do. So having that clearly documented in some procedures, I think would really help provide that clarity that's needed.
Any other question?
Not at this stage, I believe.
Right. If there's no any other question, I think we will probably end there. And if I can say a big thank you to everyone for joining us today for the webinar on the role of council procurement in disaster recovery. And thank you very much, Bronwyn, for your valuable insights. And now I would like to remind everyone that the recording of today's webinar will be uploaded on LGP website. For more information about how LGP Consulting can help in disaster recovery procurement, please contact us via our email, consulting@lgp.org.au. And then the last thing is that we do run webinars across the whole year. So I would also like to invite you to join us for next webinars in the coming year. Now we end our webinar today, and have a good day.
Thank you.